The Candlemaker's Curse, Part 3. Chapter 17, The Choice of the Damned. Sylas stood at the precipice of something far greater than he had ever imagined, the weight of magic, history, and fate pressing against his very soul. The first flame burned before him, waiting, patient, unchanging. The truth had unraveled before his eyes, revealing not a single moment of creation, not a single warlock who had shaped the first fire, but a cycle, a curse passed from one to another, a burden carried by those foolish or ambitious enough to believe they could wield it without consequence. The realization dug into him like a blade, sharper than any betrayal, deeper than any wound, because this was never about Cassiel. It had never been about Cassiel's ritual, Cassiel's deception, Cassiel's hunger for power. Cassiel had only ever been another hand in the cycle. Just as Sylas now was. He exhaled slowly, though he still did not know if he truly breathed in this place, this void between what had been and what would be. He could feel the fire inside him, waiting, whispering, curling in his veins, woven into his very bones. It was not a curse, not yet. It was a question, a demand for action, a choice. And the choice was his alone. His mind turned over every possibility, every outcome, every consequence. He could break it. He could try to unravel the cycle entirely, shatter the fire and erase its existence, tear it from the fabric of magic itself. But the fire was not a spell to be undone, not a construct of mortals, it was something primordial, something before. To destroy it would mean destroying the very essence of power, the foundation of magic that had been shaped and reshaped since the beginning of time. And what would remain? A world without warlocks? A world where those who reached for more, who sought to bend reality, would find only emptiness in return? No. He could not risk that. He would not be so arrogant as to believe he could erase something that had existed before him, before Cassiel, before all of them. He could wield it. He could claim it. He could become the next in the line of those who had tried to shape the fire, bend it to his will, become the master of what had once been an unstoppable, unrelenting cycle. He could be the last warlock. But no, that was the same mistake Cassiel had made, the same mistake they had all made, believing they could hold something in their hands that was never meant to be held. He had seen what it did to those before him, how it corrupted, how it twisted, how it consumed, how even the most careful, the most cunning, the most prepared were eventually swallowed by the weight of what they thought they could control. And yet, he could not leave it untouched. If he walked away, if he refused to act, it would find another. It always did. It would slumber for a time, waiting for the next warlock with ambition in his heart and desperation in his veins, waiting to be lit anew, waiting to be passed forward once again, waiting for another fool to take the flame and believe they were different. The fire could not be destroyed. It could not be contained. But it could be denied. A slow, measured breath, his fingers flexing, the magic curling tighter, recognizing his intent. The first flame flickered, watching. It had no mind, no will of its own, not in the way mortals did. It did not speak, did not demand, did not plead. It offered. That was the nature of power, it did not force itself upon those who did not wish to take it. It simply waited for hands bold enough to reach. Sylas would not reach. He would not take. He would not play the game. His magic surged, shifting, turning inward instead of outward, bending not to control, not to consume, but to deny. He had spent his life mastering spells that others feared, binding forces that had no place in mortal hands, unraveling the threads of fate that others believed immutable. And now he would do what none before him had done. He would refuse the fire. The moment his will solidified, the flame reacted. It flared, twisting, shifting, unraveling, fighting against his defiance because it had never been denied before. But Sylas did not falter. He did not want it. He did not seek to master it. He rejected it. The fire burned hotter, but it did not scorch him. It pulsed, but it did not consume. It fought against the nature of his refusal, because power was not meant to be abandoned. It had been taken before. It had been passed, it had been claimed, it had been bound. But it had never been left behind. The first flame flickered, the very essence of it rippling, trembling, shrinking. A soundless scream, a force with no voice, a history that had never known an end. But Sylas gave it one. His magic pushed against it, forced it away, forced it out of the cycle, out of the game, out of the reach of those who would come after. The fire twisted once more, shuddering, resisting, 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 and then it broke. Not into nothingness. Not into destruction. But into silence. The red light faded, curling in on itself, no longer searching, no longer reaching, no longer waiting. Denied. Rejected. Sealed. The cycle had not been shattered. It had not been rewritten. It had been refused. And that was enough. Sylas's body lurched, his soul snapping back, away from the first flame, away from the place outside time, away from the void that had held him in waiting. The world blurred, the air shifted, the weight of magic reversed, and then, he was falling. But this time, there was ground beneath him. His feet struck cold stone, his body staggering from the impact, breath rushing into his lungs, the sensation of physical form returning all at once. He inhaled sharply, his magic flaring around him, adjusting, resettling, recognizing the change. And when he looked up, he was back. The ruins of Cassiel's last ritual chamber stretched around him, the remnants of broken sigils etched into the ground, the shattered remains of a world that no longer held power. The air was thick with the absence of magic, with the silence of something that had been taken from existence itself. The candle that had once held Cassiel's soul was nothing more than melted wax, the fire inside it long gone, not snuffed, not transferred, just gone. And the mark on Sylas's wrist? Vanished. The cycle was over. Not destroyed. Not erased. Just ended. He let out a slow breath, his body still thrumming with exhaustion, his mind still catching up to what had just been done. He had walked away from power. And in doing so, he had denied its hold over the world, had broken the endless hands reaching for it, had done what none before him had dared to do. The first fire was gone. And now, at last, so was he. Chapter 18, Ashes Without Fire. Sylas stood in the ruins of what had once been Cassiel's prison of wax and fire, the cold air pressing against his skin, his magic coiled deep in his bones, but for the first time in his life, there was no weight. No lingering spell humming beneath his skin, no sigils burned into his soul, no tether pulling him toward something unseen. The mark on his wrist was gone, and with it, the last remaining tie to the first fire. He flexed his fingers, expecting resistance, expecting some unseen force to still be there, waiting, lurking, waiting to be claimed, but there was nothing. Nothing. The silence was more unsettling than the fire had ever been. He had spent years chasing its source, unraveling the truth, preparing for what he thought would be the final confrontation, but he had never considered what would come after. He had undone the cycle, not by breaking it, not by mastering it, but by rejecting it. And now, the world moved forward without it. His breath curled into the cold air, his mind still catching up to the enormity of what had been done, his body still remembering the burn of something that no longer existed. It felt wrong. It felt unfinished. There should have been something, some aftershock, some consequence, some reaction to what he had done. But there was only stillness. Only a world that did not yet realize what had changed. And maybe that was the worst part. He turned, his gaze moving across the ruins, across the melted wax and broken stones, across the remnants of something that had once seemed unstoppable. Cassiel was gone. His fire had burned out, his ambitions reduced to nothing more than shadows in a place no one would remember. But had he known? Had he realized in his final moments what Sylas had done? Had he understood that the game he thought he was playing had never been the game at all? Had he expected to be unmade in the way so many before him had been? Or had he thought he would return? A flicker of uncertainty twisted in Sylas's gut. Cassiel had been too calm. Even in his last moments, even as the fire took him, as his body had been rewritten into wax and flame, he had not begged. He had not screamed for mercy. He had smiled. A slow, sharp smirk, edged with something more than arrogance, something more than pride, something that had curled around his lips like the last remnant of a secret he had never spoken. And that thought, it did not sit right. Sylas exhaled sharply, pushing away the unease that threatened to coil around his mind. It didn't matter now. Cassiel was gone. The first fire was gone. He had walked away from it all, had denied its power, had refused to let it bind him the way it had bound everyone before him. That should have been the end of it. That was the end of it. He had no reason to stay in this ruin. He had no reason to keep searching for something that no longer existed. He turned toward the exit, his boots crunching against the brittle remains of what had once been enchanted stone, his step steady, final, absolute. He was leaving. He would go back to the world, back to a world without the first fire, a world where magic was not built on stolen souls, where power was not bound in wax, where warlocks did not burn in an endless cycle of debt and desperation. The world had not seen it yet, had not realized it yet, but it was different now. He was different now. And yet, as he stepped beyond the threshold of the ruin, past the place where Cassiel had once stood, past the space where he had made his choice, he felt it. A whisper. A presence, faint, distant, not a voice, not a word, but an echo. His muscles tensed, his fingers twitching at his sides, his magic flaring instinctively, reacting to something he could not see, something he should not have been able to feel. He turned sharply, eyes narrowing, scanning the empty ruin, searching for whatever had just reached for him. But there was nothing. Just silence. Just the cold wind curling through the broken chamber, through the shattered stone, through the melted remnants of a prison that no longer existed. Nothing. His jaw tightened. It was over. And yet the unease remained. Sylas clenched his fists, forcing himself to walk away, forcing his body to move even as something in his mind screamed that he had missed something. That there was something just beyond his reach, something that had always been just beyond his reach. A trick. A lie. A deception even he had not unraveled. But there was no going back. The fire was gone. The weight was gone. The war was over. He had done what no one before him had dared to do. Then why did it still feel like he had played into someone else's hands? Chapter 19, The Whisper of Forgotten Flames. Sylas kept walking, forcing each step to feel solid, real, final, but the weight of unease pressed against the back of his mind like fingers tracing the edge of a blade. The ruins of Cassiel's last stronghold faded into the distance behind him, its presence no longer laced with magic, no longer pulsing with the remnants of a fire that had shaped warlocks for centuries. It was dead. Extinguished. Yet the absence of power, the sheer silence left in its wake, did not bring the relief it should have. He had undone the cycle, severed the line of warlocks who had passed the first fire from hand to hand, ended the chain before it could claim another. The world should have felt different. Lighter. But it didn't. The air was still thick, waiting, stretched too thin, as if the moment had not yet caught up to the reality of what had been taken. Sylas exhaled, steadying his breath, his hands flexing at his sides, but the feeling did not leave him. It lingered in his bones, in the whisper of his magic, in the way the wind curled through the ruins behind him as if it were carrying something unseen. A flicker of sound brushed against his ear, not a voice, not a word, just a shift in the silence. His pulse quickened before he could stop it. He did not turn. He did not stop walking. He forced his body to keep moving, to push forward, to deny the weight of what his instincts were telling him. That something was still watching. The path ahead was uneven, the remains of what had once been a temple road and now little more than broken stone swallowed by time. Duskhaven city lights were distant, faint glimmers against the sky, barely visible beyond the skeletal remains of forgotten buildings. The city had never truly belonged to the living, it had always been built on the ruins of something older, something that refused to die completely. Sylas had once thought that was what made it powerful, the way it thrived on secrets, on ghosts, on the echoes of magic that had long since been buried beneath its streets. But now, with every step closer to its borders, he wondered if it had ever truly been free at all. The first fire had been here once. Its hands had shaped the city long before he had ever begun searching for it, long before he had ever known what he was truly chasing. A cold wind curled through the air, threading between the broken spires and twisted iron gates, and the whisper returned, closer this time, sharp, nearly audible, nearly formed. Sylas's magic reacted before he could think, instinct pressing against his skin like the static before a storm, but he did not let it flare outward. He waited. His grip tightened at his sides, his breath measured, controlled, as he finally slowed his steps. The ruins stretched in every direction, vast, empty, filled only with the remnants of the past. So why did it feel like something had followed him? The whisper curled again, brushing against the edges of his consciousness, not words, not a spell, not something human. But it carried intent. It carried knowledge. It carried purpose. And then, before he could stop himself, before he could force his own control over the moment, his mouth formed a question. Who are you? The air shifted. The ruins were silent, unmoving, but the weight pressing against them changed. The whisper did not grow louder, did not reveal itself in sound or form, but it deepened. It became something more than an echo. And in that moment, Sylas understood. This was not something that had been waiting for him. This was something that had been waiting for the fire. His blood turned cold. The first fire was gone. Extinguished. He had unraveled its reach, refused its power, cut its cycle from the world before it could claim another. But what had it left behind? His fingers twitched, his breath slow, his magic pressing outward just slightly, just enough to feel the shift in the air, to grasp at the weight of what had not yet fully revealed itself. The ruins had not changed. The world had not altered. But something had been awakened in the space between moments, something that had been waiting for the first fire to be cast aside. Sylas had thought he had denied its power, had stopped the next hand from claiming it, had ensured that it would not pass to another warlock. But he had never considered, what happened to power that no longer had a master? The realization slammed into him like a strike to the ribs, sharp, undeniable, too late. The first fire had never belonged to warlocks. It had been claimed by them. But something had existed before that. Something had watched as each warlock took hold of it, shaped it, burned for it, passed it onward, and carried the weight of its existence. But if there were no hands left to hold it, then who did it return to? A chill ran through him, colder than magic, colder than fear, older than anything he had ever encountered. The whisper was not a warning. It was not a summon. It was a summoning. Something was answering. The wind surged, sharp and cutting, and for the first time since he had stepped out of the ruins, Sylas turned. The air behind him was not empty. A shape stood where nothing had been before, tall, undefined, woven from something that did not obey the rules of form or flesh. It was neither shadow nor light, neither presence nor void. It was waiting. Watching. It had no face, no features, but its awareness burned into him like a brand. Sylas did not move. Did not breathe. did not speak. And yet it knew him. You were not meant to end it. The words did not come from the figure. They did not come from the wind, or the ruins, or the space between the stones. They came from inside him. From his blood, from his bones, from the magic that had been touched by the first fire, from the remnants of something that had refused to fully die. The whisper had not been an entity. It had been a memory. A memory of fire. A memory of something that had never been meant to be left behind. Sylas's jaw tightened, his magic curling around him, preparing, bracing, calculating. This was not Cassiel's work. This was not the Candlemaker's design. This was something before them all. Something that had been waiting for warlocks to be foolish enough to reach for power that was never theirs to begin with. Something that had allowed them to burn for it. And now that it was unclaimed, it had come to collect. Sylas exhaled slowly, his voice steady, calm, unshaken. I don't owe you anything. The air darkened. The figure did not move, did not shift, did not change, but the world did. And for the first time, Sylas wondered if he had ever truly ended anything at all. Chapter 20, The Collector of Forgotten Flames. Sylas held his ground, every muscle coiled, his magic thrumming beneath his skin like a storm waiting to break, but he did not strike. Not yet. Not without understanding what stood before him, what had come for him, what had been awakened in the absence of the first fire. The figure did not move, did not breathe, did not exist in any way that could be measured by the rules of the world he knew. It was not bound by time, not shaped by flesh, not a ghost nor a shadow nor a remnant of something that had once lived. It was other. And yet, it was here. It had come because the fire had been taken from its cycle, because the power had been refused, because Sylas had severed a connection that had never before been broken. He had undone the chain, but the weight of it still existed. The burden of the first fire had not vanished, it had simply been left behind. And now something had come to claim it. The air thickened, pressing against him, not with magic, not with force, but with expectation. The presence before him did not attack, did not move closer, did not reach for him the way Cassiel had, the way the Candlemaker had, the way warlocks before him had always sought to pull power toward them. This was not a warlock. This was something that did not need to reach, because it had already been waiting at the end of the path. It had known this moment would come. It had always known. Sylas inhaled slowly, his fingers twitching, his breath steady, but his pulse quickened, his mind calculating, unraveling, preparing. If it was here, if it had come now, then it had been watching. It had existed outside the cycle, waiting, unseen, unspoken of, because no one had ever severed the chain before. He had assumed he was breaking something, destroying something, but what if the cycle had only ever been a temporary holding place? A passage. A delay. What if warlocks had never truly controlled the fire at all? The thought sent a slow, curling unease through him, his magic bristling beneath his skin, his instinct screaming at him that he had made a mistake. Not in stopping Cassiel. Not in refusing the power. Not in undoing the cycle. But in believing that he had ended it at all. The first fire had never belonged to warlocks. It had been borrowed. And now, it had been left unattended. The figure finally spoke again, though its lips did not move, its voice weaving through the space between them, through the wind, through the magic that still pulsed faintly in the ruins, through the unseen fabric of something older than spellwork and curses. Power that is denied does not disappear. It lingers. It waits. It searches for where it must return. Sylas exhaled sharply, his mind locking onto the phrasing, every word deliberate, every word chosen with purpose. Return. Not be destroyed. Not fade. Return. He had thought the first fire was simply a source of power, something that had been shaped into what it had become through the hands of warlocks. But this thing, this presence, this entity, was it telling him that the fire had always had a destination? That it had never been meant to be held by mortal hands, but instead, it had been collected? His jaw clenched, his stance shifting slightly, his magic pulsing at the edge of his control, waiting for the answer he already knew was coming. Then where does it go? A silence. Then, the figure stepped forward. Not a step in the way a man moved, not a shift of weight or the sound of a foot touching stone, but a shift in presence, a reclaiming of space. The air rippled, the temperature dropping slightly, the wind pulling inward, and for the first time, Sylas felt the weight of it. It was not a god. It was not a warlock. It was something else. And it was tired of waiting. It comes back to me. Sylas's breath stilled. His magic flared, a violent reaction to something that had never been spoken before, something that had never been revealed in the thousands of years that the fire had passed hands. The warlocks had believed they were its masters. They had believed they were the ones shaping it, bending it, wielding it. But they had only ever been temporary vessels. The fire had always had an owner. Sylas's grip tightened at his sides, the weight of realization slamming into him with the force of an unseen tidal wave. Then you were never looking for a successor. The figure did not react with surprise, did not confirm or deny, did not shift in emotion or movement. It did not need to. The truth had already been placed before him. Warlocks had taken what was not theirs, had stolen something that had never belonged to them, had wielded it and burned for it and died believing that they had ever been in control. But they had never held it long enough to realize they had only been keeping it warm. Keeping it until the collector came. A slow, steady exhale passed from Sylas's lips, his body still thrumming with tension, his mind turning, calculating, searching for the gap in this revelation, searching for the way out, searching for the trap. But there was none. This was never a deception. It had been the truth all along. The fire had never needed to be held by warlocks. It had never belonged in the hands of mortals. It had been a stolen thing, waiting for its return. And now that it was unclaimed, now that the cycle had been broken, now that it had been left without a master, the collector had come to take it back. Sylas exhaled, his thoughts locking into place, his instincts sharp, bracing, waiting. He had spent years believing he was fighting against something meant to corrupt warlocks, meant to consume them. But what if the true horror had never been the fire itself? What if the horror was the moment it was reclaimed? His fingers twitched at his sides, his magic still pulsing, waiting, but he did not attack. Not yet. Not when he did not know what he was fighting. The collector had not struck first. It had not reached for him. It had only revealed itself, only spoken the truth, only arrived to do what had always been inevitable. Sylas lifted his gaze, locking onto the shifting form before him, the presence that had never been part of warlock history, because warlocks had never survived long enough to remember it. And what happens, he murmured, his voice even, sharp, ready, when it's finally returned? The collector did not move. Did not blink. But the world shivered. And for the first time, Sylas felt something that had nothing to do with magic, nothing to do with power, nothing to do with warlocks who had burned and betrayed and cursed themselves to endless cycles of ruin. For the first time, he felt fear. Chapter 21, The Price of What Was Stolen. Sylas did not move, did not breathe, did not let the weight of what stood before him sink its claws too deeply into his thoughts, but it was impossible not to feel it, impossible not to understand what had just been revealed. The collector did not threaten him, did not raise a hand, did not summon magic in preparation for a battle that Sylas would never have been foolish enough to start, and yet, the force of its presence alone pressed into him like a slow, tightening grip around his ribs. It did not need to fight. It had already won. He had spent years unraveling the secrets of the first fire, believing it to be the root of something ancient, believing that warlocks had been the ones who had shaped it, twisted it, cursed themselves with it. But they had only been borrowers. And now the true owner had arrived. His magic flared instinctively, sharpening, waiting, resisting, because magic did not yield, it did not surrender, it did not submit, and yet every pulse of power beneath his skin felt wrong. Like it no longer belonged here. Like it was something that should not have been allowed to exist at all. The collector did not advance, did not press closer, but Sylas could feel it reaching beyond sight, beyond presence, beyond time, stretching into the places where warlocks had carved their stolen flame into existence. The remnants of the first fire still lived in him, in the magic that had been touched by it, in the countless spells he had learned, in the knowledge that had been passed from warlock to warlock, in every trace of the fire's long and violent history. And now, the collector had come for all of it. Sylas exhaled, slow, measured, even as his muscles locked in place, even as his mind turned over the possibilities, searching for the gap, the weakness, the space in which he could act before this thing could take what it had come to reclaim. "You waited until now," he murmured, his voice steady, his breath calm despite the sharp pulse of warning running through his veins. "You let warlocks hold on to it. Let them pass it from hand to hand, let them bind it, burn for it, die for it." His eyes flickered, watching, searching for any shift, any flicker of reaction, any sign of will. Why? The air pressed tighter. The collector did not answer at first, but the world itself did. The space between them shuddered, like reality was shifting under the weight of a truth too vast to be contained, too great to be spoken aloud. When it finally responded, its voice did not cut through the air, it slipped beneath it, into his mind, into the very essence of what he was, into the marrow of magic itself. Because it was not yet whole. Sylas's breath stilled. The first fire had not simply been used. It had been broken. His thoughts snapped through the memories, through the visions he had seen, through the history woven in wax and flame, the moments where warlocks had taken it, reforged it, reshaped it, believed they were crafting something new when in reality they had only ever been taking pieces. The fire had been fractured, spread across generations, shattered into thousands of smaller flames, each one tied to the hands that had carried it. And now, for the first time in centuries, Sylas had undone the cycle. The broken pieces had nowhere else to go. And now, the collector had come to take them back. His grip tightened at his sides, his magic bristling, resisting, refusing, because even though he had rejected the fire, even though he had denied its power, the pieces were still inside him, inside his blood, inside his very existence. He had touched too much of it, unraveled too many of its secrets, traced too many of its paths, and now, he was part of what had been left behind. His jaw clenched, his pulse steady even as realization pressed into him like iron. "You think I'm one of them," he said quietly, but there was no humor in it, only certainty. The collector did not respond. It did not have to. Sylas inhaled, slow, calm, bracing. "Then tell me this, if the fire was never meant to be taken, if warlocks were never meant to hold it, never meant to shape it, why was it broken in the first place? Who did they steal it from?" The moment the words left his mouth, the world shook. Not the ground. Not the air. Something deeper. Something older. Something underneath everything he had ever known. The collector did not flinch, did not shift, did not react, and yet Sylas felt the weight of the silence that followed, as if he had spoken something that had never been meant to be spoken, as if he had placed a single hand on a door that had never been meant to open. And then, for the first time since it had appeared, the collector moved. A step forward, slow, deliberate, and Sylas felt it. The weight of everything that had ever been taken, every warlock who had ever touched the flame, every bargain that had ever been struck, every soul that had burned for what they did not understand. It was all there, pressed into this one moment, into him, into the remnants of the fire that had latched onto his magic like an echo waiting to be reclaimed. "You are asking the wrong question." The words dug into him like hooks, threading through his thoughts, pulling. Sylas's breath came slow, measured. He did not step back, did not flinch, did not let the weight of what he was facing crush him beneath it. "Then tell me the right one." The collector's form rippled, shifted, and though it had no face, Sylas could feel the weight of its unseen gaze settling upon him, locking onto something deep beneath his skin, beneath his magic, beneath the bloodline of warlocks that had shaped the world for centuries. "Do you think you were the first to refuse it?" A chill ran through him, deeper than before, deeper than the fire had ever burned, deeper than any curse that had ever lingered in his veins. His magic twisted. Because the answer was already there. Because of course he wasn't. And if he wasn't the first, then where were the others? The collector did not wait for him to respond. It knew he had already grasped it. It had seen this moment before. And now, he had to decide whether or not he wanted to see what came next. The wind curled, slow and deliberate, pulling at the edges of something unseen. And Sylas knew, this was no longer about taking back what had been stolen. This was about finding those who had paid the price for refusing it. And the price they had paid was not death. Chapter 22, Those Who Refused the Fire. Sylas's pulse remained steady even as the weight of realization pressed against his ribs, tightening, wrapping around him like unseen chains. The collector did not move closer, did not demand, did not pull at him the way Cassiel's spells had, the way the first fire's lure had tried to thread itself into his soul, but it did not need to. It had already placed something inside him, a seed of knowledge that could not be undone, a question that had never been asked because no one had survived long enough to ask it. "Do you think you were the first to refuse it?" The words still hummed in his mind, sinking into his thoughts, twisting through his instincts, unraveling every certainty he had believed until now. He had thought he was unique. He had believed himself to be the first warlock to walk away from the fire, the first to see its deception for what it was, the first to understand that the cycle was never about power, it was about holding something in place. He had assumed that was the end of it. That by breaking the pattern, by rejecting the fire, by letting it remain unclaimed, he had stopped what had been happening for centuries. But now, standing before the entity that had waited for this moment, for the first true break in the cycle, he knew how foolish that assumption had been. If he was not the first, if there had been others before him, then what had happened to them? His breath was slow, controlled, measured, but his magic pulsed beneath his skin in quiet defiance, waiting, bracing, even as the air thickened around him, even as the ruins behind him seemed to stretch, as if they had never been truly abandoned, as if something had been waiting beneath them, beneath time, beneath memory, beneath the history of every warlock who had ever touched the first fire. His fingers twitched at his sides, every part of him preparing for an attack, but the collector did not strike. It simply waited. Waited for him to ask. And that was the worst part. The fact that it knew. The fact that it had always known. Sylas exhaled, his gaze locked onto the figure, his mind calculating every possible angle, every possible deception, every possible path forward, but there was no trick here. No illusion. No game. Only truth. And the truth was that something had always come after those who refused the fire. He lifted his chin slightly, his voice quiet but sharp, cutting through the charged air between them like a blade. "Then tell me where they are." The moment the words left his lips, the world shuddered. Not the ground. Not the ruins. Not anything physical. Something deeper. A slow, aching pull rippled through the space around him, twisting, shifting, the air itself changing as if it were no longer part of the reality he had known. The edges of the world darkened, not with shadow, but with absence, as if something had been peeled away, as if the space between existence and nothingness had begun to stretch too thin. The collector did not move, did not speak, but Sylas felt the answer even before he heard it, even before the whisper curled into his bones, deeper than magic, deeper than fire, deeper than any curse he had ever touched. They never left. His magic recoiled before he could stop it, lashing out instinctively, a sharp, defensive pulse that crackled in the air around him, but it met nothing. No resistance. No force. No barrier stopping it. The realization struck him an instant later. The walls of reality had already thinned. And then, he heard them. Not words. Not voices. Not human speech. But whispers. Low and fractured, distant yet too close, curling through the ruins, through the stone beneath his feet, through the air between his breaths, through the space he had thought was empty but had never truly been abandoned. The whispers did not come from one direction, did not originate from a single source. They were everywhere. A flicker of movement at the edge of his vision. A shape shifting in the corner of the ruins. A flickering presence, not fully formed, not trapped but not free. Sylas turned sharply, his magic snapping to his fingertips, ready, defensive, waiting, but there was nothing to strike. Because these were not enemies. These were not creatures that had come to attack him. They were the warlocks who had come before him. The ones who had refused. His throat tightened, his breath slow, steady, unmoving as the figures took shape, not fully corporeal, not bound to flesh, but trapped in something else. Someplace else. They were not ghosts. Not spirits in the way mortals understood them. They were held. Suspended. Not in life, not in death, not burned by the fire, but removed from time itself. The weight of the moment pressed against him, hard, like a closing door, like something irreversible, like something that had never truly been spoken aloud, because no one had ever survived long enough to realize it. These warlocks had not died. They had not been burned. They had not escaped. They had been taken. And Sylas had almost joined them. His jaw tightened, his fingers flexing, his pulse thrumming in his ears, his magic curling in quiet, cold defiance. "This is what happens," he murmured, not as a question but as a statement, as an answer he had already begun to understand. "This is the price for refusing it." The collector did not respond. It did not need to. The proof stood before him. Warlocks who had denied the fire. Warlocks who had seen the cycle for what it was and walked away. Warlocks who had done what he had done, and vanished from history. The first fire had never needed a master. It had never needed to be passed from one warlock to the next. That was only what mortals had assumed. The real cycle, the true curse, had never been about the fire. It had been about what happened when you refused it. Sylas exhaled slowly, his mind locking onto the only question left. He lifted his gaze to the collector, to the unseen force behind the shifting mass of reality that had swallowed those before him. "You took them." A pause. A slow, sharp inhale. "Why?" The collector shifted again, the edges of its presence pressing into the whispers, into the fractured remnants of those who had come before. And when it spoke, it did not speak in warning, in deception, in riddles. It spoke in finality. Because nothing is given back without a cost. The words landed like a lock clicking into place, a door sealing shut. And Sylas understood. The warlocks had thought they were making a choice. Had believed that walking away was an act of defiance, an escape, a way to ensure that the fire did not claim them. But refusal was never freedom. They had simply passed into another set of hands. Because the first fire was never the highest power in this game. There had always been something above it. Something waiting for what had been stolen to be returned. And now, Sylas had refused it too. And the collector was deciding whether or not he would be allowed to leave. Chapter 23, The Price of Refusal. Sylas did not move, did not breathe, did not let his magic flare outward in reckless defiance, because every instinct told him that whatever bound these warlocks, whatever had claimed them after their refusal, was already reaching for him. The air was thick with something older than magic, something woven into the fabric of reality itself, something that had always been here, waiting. The warlocks who had come before him, the ones who had denied the fire, had not escaped its grasp. They had been taken somewhere else. Not burned. Not killed. Not erased. Removed. Their presence flickered at the edges of his vision, shapes that were not entirely there, faces that did not fully form, voices that whispered not in language but in the weight of what had been lost. This was not undeath, not an afterlife, not a curse in the way mortal men understood. This was an existence without time. His breath came slow, controlled, measured, but his mind was already calculating, already turning over the meaning, the purpose, of what he was seeing. If the first fire had always belonged to another, if warlocks had only been borrowing its power, then the fire was not the true cost. The cost was what came after. A choice that had never truly been a choice at all. Those who burned for it had at least been part of something. They had contributed to the cycle. But those who rejected it, they had broken something. They had stepped beyond the rules, had denied the path, and for that, they had been taken somewhere the world would never find them again. His fingers curled at his sides, his pulse slow, steady, locked into an iron will that he would not break. He would not be taken. He had spent too long chasing the fire, too long unraveling the cycle, too long peeling back the deception woven through history to become another forgotten whisper. His gaze lifted, locking onto the shifting presence of the collector, the unseen force that had never been mentioned in warlock history, the thing that had been waiting outside of time, outside of memory, outside of the hands that had touched the fire but never realized they were not the ones in control. You've already made your decision. His voice was low, even, measured. It was not a question. He already knew the answer. The collector did not come to negotiate. It did not come to make offers. It came because he had severed something that was never meant to be severed. The first fire had always had a purpose, had always been passed from warlock to warlock, not because they were its masters, but because they were its jailers. And now, it was unbound. A pause. A slow shift in the air, reality bending slightly at the edges of perception, and then, a single answer. Yes. Sylas exhaled slowly, his magic coiling, preparing, resisting, because if the decision had already been made, then there was only one way forward. His mind was already moving ahead, already seeing the shape of the outcome before the words had even fully settled in the air. The warlocks who had come before him had not fought. They had refused the fire, thinking that was the only act of rebellion they could take, believing that was the end of their role. But they had not understood what they were truly fighting against. Sylas did. His voice was steady, his breath unwavering, his magic simmering just beneath his skin, waiting for the exact moment to strike. Then I refuse your judgment, too. The world shattered. Not in sound, not in light, not in anything that could be measured by mortal senses, but in the weight of what had just been spoken. The collector did not move, did not shift, did not change, but the whispers did. The trapped warlocks, the remnants of those who had come before, they heard him. And for the first time, their whispers were not echoes of loss. They were echoes of recognition. The moment stretched too long. The air was too still. Chapter 24, The Warlock Who Would Not Be Taken. The shift in the air was imperceptible at first, a subtle unraveling of something that had always been woven too tightly, something that had existed in the spaces between power and punishment, between ownership and servitude, between fate and choice. The moment Sylas spoke his defiance, the whispers changed. They did not grow louder, did not form words, did not cry out as the trapped warlocks might have if they still possessed voices of their own. But the very fabric of the space around him tensed. It was not just the collector that had heard him. It was them. The ones who had come before. The ones who had been taken. The ones who had walked the same path, made the same choice, believed that rejecting the fire was the end of their battle, only to discover the true price. The collector did not move, but Sylas felt the weight of its awareness pressing into him, not with hostility, not with anger, but with something far more dangerous, certainty. It had always known he would end up here. Just as it had known all the others would, too. The warlocks who had refused the fire had not disappeared. They had not been destroyed. They had been kept. Held between realities, removed from the timeline they had once belonged to, erased not by death but by the act of being forgotten. Not prisoners. Not ghosts. Possessions. And now, Sylas was meant to be one of them. But he had spoken. He had defied the judgment. The others had not. The warlocks before him had accepted their fate, had believed there was no battle left to fight. They had seen the fire as the only enemy, seen the war as the struggle to refuse it, and once they had done so, they had allowed themselves to be taken, because they had never understood what they were truly fighting against. But Sylas understood now. The war had never been about the first fire. The war had been about what had been waiting for it to be relinquished. A slow inhale, steady, measured, deliberate. His magic curled just beneath his skin, restrained but humming with power, waiting, listening. The whispers around him were no longer passive, no longer simply lingering in the background, no longer remnants of something broken and lost. They had heard him. And in that moment, he realized something the collector had not accounted for. None of them had ever fought back. The collector was not a god. It was not an ancient warlock who had once held the fire and twisted it into something more. It was not a force of nature, not a vengeful remnant of the first wielder of magic, not the consciousness of the fire itself seeking to reclaim what had once been its own. It was something else entirely. It was an enforcer. A force designed to reclaim what had been taken. A being whose sole existence was to restore what had been removed from its rightful place. The fire had been broken. Stolen. Passed down from hand to hand by those who had no claim to it, bound into cycles by men who thought they understood power, but the collector had never stopped waiting. It had never stopped watching. And when a warlock refused the fire, when they severed themselves from the cycle, when they walked away, they became something that should not exist. A loose thread. A flaw in the order of things. And the collector did what it had always done. It took them. Erased them. Sealed them away. Removed them from history. Not out of malice. Out of function. But Sylas had seen the cracks in the world. He had seen how magic could be broken, how the rules could be rewritten, how power was never as absolute as those who wielded it wanted to believe. And now, he was standing in a place that had never been meant to be seen. His gaze flicked between the figures shifting at the edges of the space, the trapped warlocks who had come before him, their forms flickering, caught in between reality and something else. If he could see them, if they could hear him, then they were not beyond reach. They had not been completely erased. They had only been contained. And that meant there was still something left to break. His voice was steady, controlled, edged with the sharp weight of inevitability. You never expected someone to resist you, did you? The moment the words left his mouth, the entire world tightened. The collector did not react in a way that could be seen, did not lash out, did not shift its form, did not summon power to strike him down. But Sylas felt it. The pressure, the tension, the first shift in something ancient and unyielding. A law that had never been questioned. A force that had never been defied. And that was when he knew. The collector was not invincible. It had simply never been challenged. The trapped warlocks had accepted their fate. Sylas would not. His magic flared. Not wildly, not recklessly, but with precision, with intent. He did not strike at the collector itself, it was not a being to be destroyed. He did not lash out at the whispers, did not attempt to unravel the warlocks who had already been taken. Instead, he turned his power against the space itself. Against the prison. The moment his magic touched the boundaries of the world, reality screamed. The whispers surged, not in fear, but in recognition. Sylas's magic did not fight to burn the collector, did not seek to overpower it. Instead, it wove between the whispers, pulled at the tethers keeping them in place, began unraveling what had been sealed for centuries. The weight of forgotten power shuddered, cracked, bent. The collector finally moved, not out of anger, not out of desperation, but out of correction. A force being met with something it had never encountered before. Resistance. Sylas did not stop. He pushed. Magic surged from his fingertips, sharp, controlled, precise, threading through the broken spaces where warlocks had been trapped, pulling at what remained of them, calling them back into existence. And for the first time, they answered. The whispers became voices, indistinct but rising, growing louder, clearer, stronger. The trapped warlocks recognized the path he was carving. They had never tried before. Never believed they could undo what had been done. But Sylas had seen the lie. The collector was not death. The collector was a warden. And wardens could be overthrown. The edges of the world shattered. A tremor ran through the space, the darkness curling at its edges, the weight of what had been contained for too long beginning to slip. The whispers surged forward, becoming something more, becoming what they had once been. And as the space fractured, as the warlocks began to break free, Sylas turned his gaze back to the collector, and smiled. You should have taken me faster. The last seal snapped. And the prison collapsed. Chapter 25, The Warlocks Who Returned. The moment the prison collapsed, the world lurched. Not just in space, not just in form, but in the fabric of existence itself, the very foundation of what had held these warlocks trapped for centuries breaking apart all at once. The air cracked like glass under pressure, fragments of reality splintering, peeling away, unraveling. The darkness that had once been absolute was no longer seamless, no longer impenetrable. It was breaking open. Sylas could feel the shift, the pull of something greater than magic, something older than spells and curses, something that had been constructed to hold, to contain, to erase. And now, it was failing. The whispers had transformed into voices, rising, echoing through the collapsing void, no longer fractured remnants of forgotten warlocks, no longer echoes of those who had been taken, but real. Their presence was no longer uncertain, no longer flickering between existence and nothingness. They were stepping back into the world. The warlocks who had been erased, who had been removed, who had been lost to time were returning. Sylas exhaled, his magic coiled tightly around him, not in defense, but in purpose. He had done what none before him had done, not by shattering the fire, not by overpowering it, but by understanding the lie beneath it. The collector had never been a god, never been a master of the first fire. It had simply been the one that came to collect. The enforcer of a law that had never been meant to be broken, the unseen force that ensured warlocks who walked away did not walk too far. But they had walked now. They had walked free. The space around them twisted, unraveled, screamed. The structure that had once been unshakable, once thought to be an unbreakable law, was falling apart beneath its own weight. The collector stood at the center of the unraveling, motionless, expressionless, watching. It did not rage. It did not strike out. It simply watched. Sylas narrowed his eyes, his magic pressing outward, steady, unwavering, ready. But the battle was already over. He had not fought the collector. He had rejected it. And in doing so, he had done something it had never anticipated. He had changed the game. The weight pressing against his ribs lightened, the last remnants of unseen chains slipping away as the void collapsed inward, pulling itself apart, folding into something too vast to be understood. The warlocks who had once been shadows stood whole again. Their forms were uncertain, blurred at the edges, but their eyes were sharp. The first one stepped forward. A woman, tall, her dark hair pulled back, her hands curling as if feeling the shape of her own body for the first time in centuries. Her magic hummed. Not uncertainly, not weakly, strong. Whole. She turned to Sylas, her gaze locking onto his, something unreadable in her expression, something that carried the weight of a truth he had yet to fully understand. You did what none of us could. Her voice was low, edged with something that was neither gratitude nor disbelief but understanding. Not praise, not awe, but recognition. Sylas did not speak, did not break his stance, but he saw the truth in her words. The warlocks who had been taken before him had believed they had been making the only choice left. That rejecting the fire meant accepting their fate. But fate had never been the true enemy. The collector shifted, its form flickering, the last remnants of its function breaking apart as the space that had held them all unraveled completely. It did not speak again. It did not need to. It had lost. And it knew it. Sylas watched as its form thinned, its edges curling inward, not in pain, not in rage, but in completion. Its purpose had been severed. The cycle had been broken. And without that purpose, it no longer had reason to exist. The warlocks who had been lost for centuries stood in the ruins of what had once been their prison. No longer shadows, no longer whispers, no longer forgotten names erased from history. They were free. But what came next? Sylas turned, the weight of what had just happened settling into his bones, not as exhaustion, not as fear, but as something inevitable. He had undone something that had been woven into magic for centuries. He had changed the shape of history, had broken the final law that had ensured warlocks who defied the fire never returned. But now that they had, the world would have to reckon with them. His gaze flicked across the gathered warlocks, each one standing in silent understanding, their presence pressing against reality like something that had been forced into stillness for too long and was only now beginning to breathe again. They were no longer bound. But that did not mean they were unchanged. The woman spoke again, her voice sharp, knowing. We cannot return to the world as it was. Sylas met her gaze. No. They had been erased. If the world had ever remembered them, it had long since moved forward. The magic that had held them was gone, the laws that had bound them undone. But that did not mean their places had been waiting for them. They would not be welcomed back. And yet, they had not survived this long only to remain in the shadows. A slow breath, the weight of the moment settling. The first fire was gone. The collector had failed. The warlocks who had been erased were standing once again. Sylas's magic settled around him, his stance shifting slightly, his awareness stretching into the silence that followed. This was not the end. This was the beginning of something new. The woman lifted her chin slightly, the corner of her mouth curving in something too sharp to be a smile, something closer to acceptance. So what now, warlock? Sylas exhaled, his gaze moving past her, past the ruins of a prison that no longer existed, past the unraveling remnants of a law that had been defied. And he smiled. Now? We remind the world who we are. Epilogue, the ones who remembered. The world did not notice at first. The air did not shift, the rivers did not rise, the skies did not darken with omens. The people went about their lives as they always had, unaware that the balance of power had changed, that something old had been broken, that something long erased had returned. Magic still flowed, spells still whispered through the hands of those who wielded them, but the oldest warlocks, the ones who had studied the deep foundations of power, the ones who traced their knowledge through the ages, they felt it. They awoke in the night with an unease pressing against their ribs, with a name on the tip of their tongues that they could not quite grasp. They turned their eyes toward the ancient ruins, toward the forgotten places, toward the empty spaces where something should have been. And though they could not say why, they were afraid. Because the warlocks who had been taken had come back. It was not a war. It was not a declaration. It was not the thunderous return of an army seeking vengeance for their lost time. It was quiet. A name that should not exist appearing in the margins of an old spellbook. A signature in ink that should have faded centuries ago. A door opening in a house that had been abandoned long before the city was built around it. The world did not see them return, but it felt them. And in the silence of it all, Sylas walked among them. He had not led them. He had not commanded them. He had simply opened the door. And now, they were deciding what to do with the world that had long since left them behind. Some returned to what they had once been, seeking remnants of the lives they had lost. Some embraced the new age, learning what had changed, adapting, shaping themselves into something more than what they had been before. Some simply disappeared, slipping into the shadows, becoming myths before they could even be remembered. But there were others. Others who had spent too long forgotten. Others who did not forgive. The first fire was gone. The collector had failed. The laws that had governed warlocks for centuries had been undone in a single moment of defiance. But what did that mean? What had truly been lost? What had truly been freed? The cycle had been shattered, but what had it been holding back? Sylas did not know. But he would find out. As he walked through the city streets of Duskhaven, through alleys and roads that pulsed with unseen history, with forgotten things stirring beneath its stones, he felt the shift beneath his feet. The weight of the unknown pressing against him. The world had lost something it had never realized was holding it together. And now? Now it would remember. He adjusted the collar of his coat, the cold air curling around him, the hum of magic thick in his veins, sharp and waiting. There were still too many questions, too many things left unanswered, too many secrets that had been buried beneath time. And Sylas Blackthorne had never been the type to let a mystery remain unsolved. A slow smirk curled across his lips as he stepped forward, disappearing into the streets, into the shifting shadows of a world that had just begun to understand what it had lost. And what it had just regained. The warlocks had returned. And they would never be forgotten again.
Every story has an ending, but some mysteries live on. If you enjoyed this tale, don't let it fade into the shadows. Smash that like button and subscribe for more thrilling stories that will transport you beyond the veil of the ordinary. Subscribe to our channel and your name will appear at the beginning of our next video, where we will pleasantly thank you for your subscribing. Tap the bell icon so you never miss a journey into the unknown. Share your thoughts in the comments. What twists did you see coming? And what secrets do you think still remain? Until next time, stay curious, stay brave, and let the next story begin.